So yeah, so I wanted to start by outlining some of the goals, what I was trying to do in this piece, which hopefully came through. And if it didn't, please let me know. Then I'll talk about some issues that I have that maybe people can help address. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the audience of the paper and what I'm trying to do with it. So my goal in this paper, in reading a lot of the scholarship on the Second Coalition and the Napoleonic Wars in general, um, there's especially on the Russian kind of contribution to the Napoleonic Wars, there's a real emphasis on the sort of great power machinations that went into forming the coalition and all the like diplomatic exchanges, the Russo-Austrian um, uh, clashes and so forth. And these are really valuable contributions. But what I found is that they tend to very much sideline the ideological aspect of what was going on. So they don't take a lot of time to think about the motivations of actors like Emperor Paul, who and I wanted to sort of restore the weirdness of this fact of the 1799 intervention. I mean, this idea of sending Russian troops 1,000 miles to Italy to try to establish some kind of counter-revolutionary movement is actually very strange, right? And I thought that focusing on this strangeness was a good way to reanalyze this event. So kind of bringing the ideology back in was my main goal. And within that, my goal is to sort of specify some of what I see as the key features of that ideology. And for me, there are three salient features, which hopefully, again, came out in the paper. The first is legitimism as a principle of rule that extends sort of not just a Romanov dynastic legitimism, but just the principle of legitimate monarchy more generally. Second, religious ecumenism, which is in some ways even more important. This idea that religion in itself, much more than than even Orthodox Christianity, for example, is the kind of a safeguard and a barrier and a sort of life world for the resistance against the revolution. And so, you have this anecdote which I opened my paper, this weird encounter between the Catholic Archbishop of Verona and the Orthodox general who has come from so far away. I think it's very interesting that there's this pronounced ecumenist element there. And then finally, a sort of transnational aristocratism, this idea that that the social hierarchy of the aristocratic order and the principle of aristocracy in general is, again, one of the safeguards of monarchy, the safeguards of religion and social stability and social order and so forth. And I thought that these three principles are really important because they don't just extend to Russia, right? They operate within a pan-European framework. And so Paul is not just thinking about securing the stability of the aristocracy within Russia itself against revolution or the legitimacy of the monarchy and so forth. He's thinking about it in terms of how they operate all over Europe, and in some ways even all over the world in certain cases. So those are the basic ideological principles that I thought animated this intervention. And then finally, more broadly, my goal is to place Paul's efforts within this pan-European context, right? So I think that it's really important for us as historians to study the era of Paul, which in many of us have not really known what to do with. There's this trope that he was insane, that he was, or even, as Andrei Zorin puts it, that he was just too radical to make any kind of contact with social or cultural elites. And I think that that's not true. I think that there are significant continuities between Paul and Catherine, as well as between Paul and Alexander, and that these continuities are really worth studying because I think they illustrate a particular kind of principle of reaction to the French Revolution. And I think that they make more sense when you think about them, not within the context of Russia, but within the context of Russo-European relations and Russia's broader place in Europe. So those are the goals of the paper, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to comment a bit on whether I've achieved them or not. In terms of issues with the paper, one of the things that I'm concerned with is it's a bit lightly sourced, and that's partially a result of COVID. I wasn't able to do the kind of archival research for this that I would have normally liked to do. You know, I had plans to go to the military historical archive in Moscow and look at some of the documents there, but basically I was only able to go to Russia for a week in 2 years, and it has not been possible. But in terms of, if you can point me to other sources, or both primary and secondary, I'd be extremely grateful. That's always extremely valuable. And I'm really excited to see what people suggest. Another issue is that the concluding portion, where I talk about the relationship between the intervention and sort of conservative thinking in Europe, it feels important to the paper, but it also feels like it dangles a bit, like it's sort of, and I've kept thinking about ways to sort of reintegrate it into the paper, but I could never find a way to make it work. So if you have any suggestions on how I can, on whether you think that this last portion needs to be reintegrated or whether it's fine the way it is, I'm happy to hear your suggestions on that score. So that concluding portion is kind of a thorn in my side, but I very much want it to be there because I think it serves an important function. And then finally, the more overarching concern I have with this paper, well, not finally, but the overarching concern I have with this paper is really that it's, I'm afraid that it's a little obvious. And I don't know, maybe it's just obvious to me because I've been digging into these documents for so long. But if it does seem obvious, then I would like to have some suggestions for, like, if you have any suggestions for making it more interesting or more incisive. That's obviously a tall order for a seminar like this, but I would be very curious what you think about that. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the audience of the paper. I would like to publish this as an article in a more general interest journal. Ideally, you know, once it's much more polished, something like the Journal of Modern History or Past and Present or something like that. And obviously, the article is not yet at the stage where it can be published in one of those types of venues, but I would very much like it to be. So any suggestions on that score would be really valuable. And especially what is vague or unclear about the paper in terms of sort of the, like, as non-special, if you're a non-specialist in this area, what could be made more clear, what could be made more accessible to people who are not in the Russia field. And finally, in terms of a kind of an ambitious article publication, I'm curious what you think of the importance of the historiographical intervention here. I mean, have I really made the case that ideology is essential to understanding this, and in a way that previous authors have not considered? And the answer may be no, in which case I need to spend a lot more time working on it. But I would be very curious what you all think about that. So that's about all I have. I could summarize the paper in more depth if that would be helpful, but I think that for the most part, people have read it. And I'm very curious to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Greg. So just people, if you can raise your hand, there's two screens here. So Eric has already raised his hand, and if there's more, I will just keep a list. But I see Eric and Tommaso, so why don't you start, and then Brad. Eric, Tommaso, Brad. And I'll work myself in there somewhere appropriate.
Greg, I really enjoyed reading this. It's very well written, and it tackles a central question in the writing and history of foreign policy, which is the primacy of ideology, which I think is kind of taken for granted under Nicholas I and later, when all of these concepts are clearly ideologies. But what I think one of the things that you might want to explore a little bit more is that this era that you're talking about is when reaction and monarchism and legitimacy emerge as explicitly ideological. I don't think they really were. I think most people don't think they really were prior to the era of the French Revolution. And, you know, Burke and, you know, Pipes writing about Karamzin makes this case that he was the first conservative to really turn it into an ideology. So some sort of discussion of placing the argument that you have, which is very convincing, that ideology was, if not primary, then right up there as the leading factor in a lot of the decisions of this era. But some sort of linkage of that discussion, the grainy discussion, with the broader problem of this being the emergent sort of era for traditionalism, legitimacy, ecumenism, defense of autocracy as forced by a reaction to the French Revolution. That linking it to Burke and de Maistre and Karamzine a little bit more. You do mention Karamzine. That was my most general reaction, is that I'd like to see that side of things developed a little bit more. And I think, too, like your three characteristics are right on. They strike me as right on. But two of them, legitimism and ecumenism, strike me as more new than defense of aristocracy, perhaps. I don't know, maybe that's just my gut reaction. But anyway, I think trying to draw this story into the specific ideologically charged newness of the intervention of ideology into foreign policy making, and more generally into politics, but specifically into foreign policy making, I think would be a very major introduction. And that sort of framing might take you more into the literature on foreign policy history, which deals with this explicitly in later areas predominantly. But I mean, you're in the earlier era. Shoot, I had something else and I have forgotten what it is, but I'll just leave it at that.
So Greg, it's up to you if you want to respond to each one or you want to take more. It's really your call.
I don't have much to say other than thank you. These are really helpful. And I think I do need to do some work with establishing these principles elsewhere than in Burke. I think I've focused a bit too narrowly on Paul and the Russian side, but I think the value of it would come out much more strongly if I had placed it in more of a transnational context. So thank you. That's really useful.
Well, at one point you do refer to the war of ideas in Europe, and that's sort of an obvious place to develop, considering that the article is quite short right now. So that was one of my comments, but Tommaso is next.
Hi, thank you. Now, I come obviously as an outsider, and I have a question, but it's partially predicated on whether there is in fact a typo in the paper, because my question is about a point you make about republics. So I wanted to ask you, on page 6, the paragraph that starts Catherine's reaction, you say, there was an absolute legitimism and emphasized the centrality of the monarchical principle. Republics like the United States or the Netherlands were not objectionable per se, but only insofar as they entailed the overthrow. I assume you mean as they did not entail the overthrow of a legitimate monarch. Is that correct?
Right. So republics are objectionable only if a republic replaces a monarchy.
Okay. So my question was, in the specific Italian context of 1799, you make some good points about Savoy-Piedmont, which obviously the Austrians have a specific agenda about, and where the Russians are pursuing a different point of view. But there's a kind of a big elephant in the room, which is the Republic of Venice, which, one of the most legitimate governments in the history of Europe. It's been there for 1,000 years. It's just been abolished, and obviously the Austrians are ready to gobble it up. Do the Russians have any position on Venice, and whether it too should be somehow restored to its independence?
That's a really interesting question. I have not. I didn't run into anything related to Venice in the documents, although maybe I wasn't paying close attention, but they do talk a lot about Genoa. And their attitude is basically that the Genoese, they need their republic as long as it's free of French influence, essentially. And so Suvorov is very concerned about the sort of popularity of Austria in Genoa, and he thinks that he can get the Genoese people on his side, essentially. But that's not. And I believe Genoa was a republic for almost as long as Venice, right?
Yeah, although with less of a continuous tradition of independence, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah.
I mean, I'm just asking because that was sort of, for Italian Jacobins and others, that was sort of the ultimate crime of Napoleon, was sort of sacrificing Venice to his own policies and ambitions. And, and if there is any legitimacy argument to be made, Venice would seem to have a very high claim on that argument. It's not replaced the monarchy, it's not overthrown anybody, and it's older than most monarchies in Europe. So it's interesting if it doesn't come up at all.
Mhm.
Because of course, Verona is actually where you introduce your story. Verona is part of the Republic of Venice. So they're actually in the former Republic of Venice, which existed less than 2 years before this. So thanks.
Oh, I didn't realize that. I thought Verona was part of Piedmont Savoy.
Oh,
wow,
no,
okay.
no, no. The Republic of Venice reached all the way into what is today Lombardy, deep into Lombardy. The border with Milan was actually quite close to Milan. So Verona had been part of Venice since about 1400.
Wow, okay.
All right, so
Thank you.
thanks, Tommaso. It's great to have the Italian perspective here. And I have a long list: Brad, Bradley, Paula, Katie, Alex, and Yasin, and myself somewhere in the mix. So Brad, your hand was up.
Okay, so Greg, I really liked the paper a lot. And it made me think about several aspects of Russian conservatism, because I'm interested in the ideologues of the right, the political right, about a century later. And so I'm interested in some of the terminology, and I'm wondering what word, I'm interested in the terminology Russian absolutism, and I'm wondering what word did Paul and the ideologues of the era, what word did they use to label Russia's form of government or label Russia's form of monarchy? I mean, you write someplace that Paul created an absolutist Russian bureaucratic state. But so I'm wondering whether or not absolutism, monarchy, and autocracy at this time were used interchangeably. And you've got this guy Fuchs says, I think it's on page 14, that the godless French trample on religion, law, and autocracy. And I think he's referring there to the Italian monarchy. He's saying autocracy. Whoa, I didn't see that coming. And the reason I ask is that a century later, the right-wing ideologues say that, no, absolutism and autocracy are completely different. Absolutism, that's European, it's bureaucratic, it's based on force and coercion, it's artificial, it's the rule over people. Whereas autocracy is, well, we all know what the conservatives thought autocracy was. It was a consensus. It was the rule through the people. It was a unity of monarch and people. So then the question is, well, what happened? Because you do state very nicely, and as you stated in your opening remarks, the kind of conservative pillars of conservatism around 1800 being monarchy, religion, and aristocracy. But by Uvarov, that's a completely different triad. You don't have monarchy, you have autocracy. For religion, you've got orthodoxy, not just Christianity. And aristocracy is completely gone. You've got Narodnost. And then the Slavophiles come along and you have sort of Russian exceptionalism, a negative view of the 18th century and of Peter and of bureaucracy. And I'm wondering if the sort of very last couple of pages of your paper, where you refer to a kind of split in counter-revolutionary ideology, or another word for that might be, I think actually the synonym of conservatism is often охранительное, which to me captures very nicely that counter-revolutionary ideology to guard, to preserve. But anyway, the split, one of the strands is, I wonder if you could call it a kind of proto-Slavophile, or a kind of emphasis on Russian culture, Russian values, keep out the West, don't borrow anymore. Like Karamzin said in another place, Peter tried to make Russia like Holland, and that didn't work so well. Anyway, then I two other very quick comments that are not exact. I mean, they're sort of related, but not closely, and are much more minor. This Frenchman Bromel, it seems like he very nicely anticipates Custine, and there you have defining the Russian monarchy as despotism, and of course Custine goes to town with that. Last thing is Suvorov. A long time ago, I wrote a book on Russian firearms. And my takeaway of Suvorov was a very pithy statement about tactics. Pula dura, a shtik молодец. And it seems to me there's a kind of philosophy behind that the bullet is impersonal. It's artifice, it's manufactured, it separates, it's something that separates the soldier from his action. Whereas the bayonet, of course, is honor, it's courage, it's aristocratic, if you wanna put it that way. It's organic, it's natural, it's very different. And so I think that kind of fits in with Suvorov's ideas that you're presenting in a much different context than Pulador Shtik Молодец. But anyway, I enjoyed the paper and I'm glad I read it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, in terms of the vocabulary that they use, Fuchs in that piece uses самодержавие as the word for autocracy. They never use absolutism as far as I'm aware, but they always say монархическое правление or самодержавие, or they use thrones of various kinds as a sort of synecdoche.
But was Fuchs referring to, was talking about the French trampling on самодержавие, meaning but самодержавие was Italian?
Well, I think he's talking more generally about самодержавие, like the самодержавие of the French king, presumably. But
is that coming?
Yeah, but it is interesting that this vocabulary is being sort of unproblematically applied from the Russian context onto the European one. I think that is interesting. In terms of Bombelle, I mean, I think Bombelle is a really fascinating character in part because he does anticipate Cousin in this way, but then he becomes this Russophile. And so despite the fact that he considers the Russian monarchy a form of despotism, he nevertheless kind of signs on to Paul's vision of the conservative movement as being this sort of pan-European thing. So I think I found that very fascinating in the journals, just reading through them and seeing the virulence of his kind of anti-Russian comments, and then the shift backwards when he encounters Paul's troops in Italy. And then finally, on the question of Suvorov's tactics, I also think that's really interesting because for me, Suvorov is known for having this sort of paternalistic but very intimate relationship with his soldiers. And I think that there's an element of sort of conservative popular mobilization there that, so one of the themes I try to draw out in this paper, right, is that despite the fact that this is based on sort of this rhetoric of aristocracy and of kind of social hierarchy and so forth, that does not preclude Suvorov or Paul from appealing to a sort of popular will. They just imagine that popular will as being essentially monarchical and conservative rather than essentially revolutionary. So in other words, they try to use popular mobilization for conservative ends. And I think that that's a kind of a key moment that's easy to miss when you see all their rhetoric about, you know, how the masses should be punished for their transgressions and so forth. But they very much envision this process as having, as like involving the cooperation of the broad Italian public. And I think in that sense, the Russian soldier is part of that process. So yeah, that's my take on the Suvorov thing. But thank you very much.
I'm going to go to Katie next because she has to go, and I'm welcoming her to the Russian History Seminar. I'm not sure you've been here before, but
maybe long ago, once or twice. But
when we're in person, we'll have to show you some real Russian hospitality. So stay tuned.
Okay, I look forward to it. Sorry, I have to leave in a few minutes, but so I think it's funny that Tommaso thought he was an outsider because I'm way, way, way outside everyone. I'm a 19th and 20th century U.S. historian. But so to that point, I was particularly, my big question was audience, and it was really helpful. Like, I think this is very common in almost every presentation. I sort of wished that everything that you had said as a preface to this article in here was in the article, right? Like I felt like you articulated what your goals were sort of better here than in the article. And I felt like, of course, because I don't have any context, I felt really thrown in the first paragraph and wanted a little stage setting. And that felt, especially if you're, even though obviously Europeanists and the more general interest journals you're talking about are going to situate this much more quickly than I am, and already being the French Revolution, which obviously I know when it was, but it took me a second to be like, okay, situate. I think anyone would benefit from just like a one paragraph who was where when in this moment, right? And actually by that point, Tommaso about Venice and Verona was actually fascinating. And I wondered if you might think about if there's a way in which your conclusion, which you said felt dangly, it also really articulates your position and your kind of larger, what's the larger stakes for you, the aftermath, nicely. And I wondered if there was a way in which there was a version that could actually appear at the beginning of the paper rather than the end, just something to think about, like if that's kind of where you want to go with this, if you see what I'm saying, that you might think about if that's a place. So I felt like it did need kind of a situating opening paragraph if you want it to be for more than just Russianists, because I think other Europeanists still would want to know what's at stake. And sort of similarly with regard to how you reference historiography, you might want to think about it operating kind of on two levels, like what's at stake for Russianists and what's at stake for understanding the revolutionary era in Europe more generally, right? So when you gesture at Russian historiography versus like broader revolutionary kind of nodding to your audiences about who you're intervening with what. So for example, I actually thought like the piece about religion per se as opposed to orthodoxy or Catholicism, like the piece that's ideological about religion being a conservative force and worth preserving is was interesting and kind of I was like, oh, I see that as a kind of connective glue, and was useful, and I thought could be a way that you could kind of gesture more broadly to historians of other regions as well, because right, I think you know why. So yeah. I felt like maybe it felt a little bloodless, given that it was about revolution. Sometimes I wanted you to really how do I want to say this? It was a lot of like nominalizations, and I know this sounds really basic, but I wanted some more action verbs. Like there's a few places where you fell into passive voice about what had happened, and I wanted to see it in a more kind of forward thrusting way. And I know that can be hard with ideology, but I wondered if that might happen more naturally if you had a paragraph sort of setting the scene of which empire, which nation, whose folks are in what country when, right at this moment, and kind of placing it that way. And take it for what it's worth, because obviously I'm completely an outsider, but yeah, that would be the situating and considering whether your last part, where I think I get your voice a little bit more, actually might somehow have a version in the introduction.
Thanks, those are really helpful. And I do worry about the nominalizations. It's a tick of mine, and I think this paper could definitely stand to have a lot more action, considering how like momentous some of these events are. So
that's what I mean. I think that you can do a thing that I tell people to translate themselves, like where I have one screen and another screen, and I'm like, now write it with action like take your actual paragraph and then rewrite it with forward motion, I guess is what I'm saying, because I do think, yeah, there's a lot going on. It's quite interesting, and it's ideological, and it's material as well. So thank you, and I would love to come to the Russian workshop again. I prefer it before daylight savings. It's okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Katie.
Bye.
Thank you. Well, I think, I'm going to abuse the power of the moderator here, because my comments are more on an editorial type, so building maybe on some of what Katie said. So I think it's a logical point in the conversation, but I do think the way it's rolled out at the beginning is I had to read it a couple of times before I realized what the components of the ideology, the main components that you talked about in your oral remarks, it's a little bit obscured in the rollout. And I think you could establish early on, in addition to the elements, legitimism and ecumenism and this aristocratic, transnational, sort of aristocratic, hierarchical conception, it's also anti-French and Russocentric, right? So, and the Russocentrism, or the way the ideology is used as a vehicle for Russian dominance, even in this era of more friendly opinion towards Russia, is similar to the way, say, Pan-Slavism later was a vehicle for certain Russian interests. So it's not obvious how it's that fits in with the way the ideology is received and how it, the element of the pan-European war of ideas, as I alluded to before, could be much more developed, I think. But my main points are two more. One is that you have sort of a lot going on, a lot in this paper, in that you have Paul reconceiving his era in relation to Catherine, the Suvorov campaign, and then the aftermath, which I think is really important in terms of your theme of continuity. So there's three big parts, and yet it only weighs in at about 30 pages. So you have maybe 10 more pages to play with to flesh it out. To me, it seems like a lot hinges on your reconceptualization of Paul's reign. And it's not entirely clear why someone as sophisticated as Zorin, or why everyone else has sort of missed this whole element. And so I think you might use that as a vehicle, you know, why Paul's reign has been sort of misunderstood, and why you are able to why it wasn't, was it because it was sort of isolated from its pan-European context or something else? So use the reconceptualization of Paul as your vehicle for historiographical intervention. And then my main point perhaps is to make ideology itself into a problem, because, you know, I also am an outsider to this. I'm a 20th century historian, but I'm a historian of ideology. And, you know, ideology as a concept is invented in the French Revolution with the ideologues. There's a huge literature on ideology, and it's often sort of taken for granted that you know what you're talking about, but, you know, there are many different elements, and in each major philosophical tradition, ideology is conceptualized differently. So what I would say is, you're obviously not going to do a treatise on ideology, but you're talking about a specific kind of ideology, a counter-revolutionary ideology. And that often is, and the element of legitimism is back to Eric's comment at the outset of defending autocracy. That's sort of a, you know, going back to a previous pre-French Revolution order is sort of inherent in going back, you know, sort of looking backwards. But for Paul in particular, that's very problematic, right? Because of Catherine. So I think you could play around with the, you know, kind of literature on how to conceive ideology in its different dimensions, and what this particular instantiation of ideology is, to make it more kind of, to broaden out the reach for this journal, the broader journal that you're trying to reach. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Do you have any readings that would be good to cite on ideology as a problem? Is there?
Well, I wrote a chapter called "The Blind Men and the Elephant," where about 6 faces of ideology, where I go through a lot of that literature, and I'll send it to you. But it's written a few years ago, but there's actually a number of kind of philosophical and social science works that I can refer you to. All right, so let's see. I have Paula, Alex, and Yasin on the list.
Well, it's convenient that I'm coming after you, because I was also in favor of grappling with the issue of ideology more directly. Greg, I thought you were really effective in synthesizing all of these ideas. I actually thought the way that you codified the main threads in the paper itself was very clear. I thought you were effective in drawing the continuities before and after Paul. The area that I found the problem as a reader was that you didn't really follow through on convincing me that ideology needed to be primary as a primary explanation. So basically on page 3, you say that you want 1799, that you think it's best understood as the transposition of a newly Russocentric counter-revolutionary ideology to the field of battle, rather than ideology being an incidental part of an essentially military or diplomatic story. But I don't understand why it needs to be one or the other, why it either needs to be primary or it needs to be incidental, why ideology can't be a major thread that intersects with these other political and military objectives and is flexible, which is, in my view, the story that you actually tell when you show Paul pivoting towards Napoleon and flirting with the idea of invading India. And you also, I feel, never really follow through in saying what it is that this ideological framework can explain that other motivations can't explain. So you make a big statement like that, and I'm reading your entire paper with a very contrarian mindset. So each time you make a claim, I'm thinking, well, I can explain that in another way, from a military or a diplomatic or a political objective. And you don't really grapple with any of these other explanations. And what I was going to say, similar to what Michael had, is that as a 20th century person, the whole ideological debate is paramount, especially in World War II, ideology versus pragmatism. And a lot of these conversations have been very binary. People either viewing ideology as first and foremost, or saying, no, this is really something that we are going to ignore and talk about other motivations and other factors. So being able to connect the story that you're telling here with some of these broader debates about the role of ideology in Russian, Soviet, and even post-Soviet history, and then also drawing lines laterally between Russia during this time period and other countries, and grappling with the issue of ideology and how it intersects, I think would make this more compelling to a broader audience.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful. I guess you're right that I end up falling into this binarism that maybe I'm not actually committed to. I think, I guess what I wanted to say really is that ideology provides the sort of groundwork within which the other things take place. Like, none of this would have happened if it wasn't for ideology, right? If there was a leader who was not motivated by ideological considerations to the extent that Paul was, Russian troops would never have ended up in Italy. It was just a completely, I mean, it wasn't entirely irrational, but it was a fundamentally weird decision for Paul to take. And I think that weirdness is what I'm trying to get at. And I think only ideology explains that. But you're right that I think I make it sound more exclusive than maybe I even believe. I think within the overall framework provided by ideology, there can be a lot of pragmatism and a lot of slippage between things that are consistent and things that are not consistent. Like the Napoleon thing, which you cite, I think is a good example of that. But yeah, I think I need to maybe frame things in a less inflammatory way. I was trying to be more assertive in my argument, but I think maybe that can turn people off.
Well, if I could just add here, I mean, there's a whole debate in Soviet history launched around Martin Malia, who saw ideology as the primary factor. So there's a long tradition of debating, was it always at every turning point ideology that was primary, or does ideology take meaning in conjunction with other historical explanations? And I think you're probably, I mean, you could play around with that, but there is that debate in our own field. So again, it's all be in the literature I send you. So Alex, you've been waiting very patiently, and we haven't heard from another Dizwitiamist.
Well, first of all, I like this paper a lot, and I find the argument persuasive. It makes sense, makes a lot of sense to me. As I'm sitting here, I'm scribbling different versions of my questions on the margins of it, because I'm trying to figure out how to arrange different thoughts. Because there's a couple of thoughts that occurred to me in relation to it, in terms of, I suppose, maybe some of the framing of it, or what the larger questions and literatures are that you're engaging with. And one obviously is the origin of conservatism, right? Where does that lie? Another is, we often look at Paul as kind of the beginning of the 19th century, with a lot of major trends in Russian history, at the same time as he's an odd character, right? But that's why he gets assassinated. And it occurred to me, if you look at both Paul and Suvorov, I think they both have a historical reputation as kind of quirky individualists. I think Lotman might have a whole article somewhere about Suvorov. I mean, Suvorov, I remember, is big and something that Lotman writes, but as a representative of a particular eccentric type of 18th century nobleman. And so I think one interesting question, because the question that occurred to me as I read the paper is, are these people original thinkers? Or are they eccentric personalities? Right? I mean, you're basically saying that Paul and Suvorov are taking these elements that are really present in 18th century culture, but they're distilling them into an ideological program that hadn't been articulated in that form before. And so I guess I'm wondering, is it that they've thought it through and they developed a set of ideas and this is what they're presenting? Or is it that these are odd personalities? And because they're odd personalities, they somehow are willing to do and say things that are otherwise only latent in their culture. And by doing and saying these things, there's kind of shifting the boundaries of what's normal, so that attitudes become more normal because you have odd people doing this. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think,
yeah,
sorry, you were asking before, like, is this thinly sourced? Or you said something along those lines. And obviously, one question that one could ask oneself is, what do we know about the evolution of the ideas of Paul and Suvorov? And ideally, you'd find a whole bunch of books with marginalia and notes that Paul kept on when he read this philosopher and that philosopher. I'm guessing that probably doesn't exist. And so I think this is related to your source question, right? Whether these people are primarily original thinkers, or whether they're primarily people with original impulses. So I'd be curious what your take is on all of that.
Yeah, in terms of the last question, I mean, I'm really sort of like haunted by Roderick McGrew's biography of Paul, which I think is really excellent, and where he does a lot of that work. And I think he does make a compelling argument for Paul as having a holistic vision that you're right, it was kind of synthesized from all these like random bits and pieces, but it did make sense as a holistic vision ultimately in a revolutionary context. And I think you're right that they're both weird people. I mean, I would even compare Paul to somebody like Trump, I mean, like Trump took a lot of ideas that were floating around in the conservative mindset and synthesized them into a more or less coherent program. And I think Paul sort of did the same thing. He was able to sort of do that because he happened to be in power and kind of had the ability to put these things into practice. And I think you're right that I maybe understate the weirdness of Paul, in part because I'm eager to rescue him from the condescension of posterity. But I think there is definitely like a kind of weirdness that he's able to access that Catherine, for example, was never able to follow through on consistently. I think even by the time she died, even though she had these ideas, she was still very torn about the legacy of the Enlightenment and all this stuff. And I don't think she ever actually reached a conclusion, except insofar as she knew that she hated the revolution, but she didn't have her overall worldview did not comprehensively change as a result of it, I think. And whereas Paul's did.
I mean, if I might follow up on one point there, I think one aspect might be that Paul is the first male monarch in a long time. Mm-hmm. And if you don't count Peter III, who of course Paul would have counted, then he's really the first in a long time. And so that creates a certain space to reinvent what the whole point of the monarchy is. And Suvorov must have been the first Russian general to command a campaign in the heartland of the West, right? I mean, maybe somebody in the 7 Years' War, but that basically, I wonder to what extent also these are people who who have a lot of space to invent roles for themselves, because there hasn't been anyone quite like that before, or anyone quite in that position.
And yeah, and I think that really dovetails with Russ Martin's argument about Paul's succession law as being kind of establishing a norm for inheritance in the Russian monarchy, which of course Paul's succession law spells out that only men can inherit and all of these principles, and then that ends up binding the monarchy for the rest of its existence. And I think that is because he invests monarchy with a new kind of well, he has a new outlook on monarchy, I think, and specifically on like legitimism as a principle of rule. So I think you're right that there's something there that I need to follow through on.
I could just interject on the original question about personality versus ideology, and that's not necessarily the only choice. It's how you conceive ideology. And the word that Greg used was worldview. I mean, so there's this notion that ideology has to be a doctrine or a system, and that in the paper, Greg, you use comprehensive and cohesive and words that imply kind of a systematic thinking. And I think that's what Alex was reacting to. But there's also a notion of ideology as a worldview, so worth considering. Yasin, you're next.
Yeah, Greg, thank you for the piece. I found it very interesting. Read it with pleasure. I think the argument is clear, and the argument about certain omissions in historiography concerning Paul. So I actually initially had two questions. I'm afraid they might sound, well, general or repetitive, considering the fact that Professor David Fox and Professor Martin already mentioned and expressed it much better than me. But anyway, one of them about the concept of ideology, and another about the sources and the content. So it's about your understanding of ideology, just has been said. Maybe some small conceptual or theoretical part, I don't know, in the beginning of article. And I don't know if it's just an article or it's a part of a bigger project, and it would be, in my opinion, valuable to think about it. And well, the question about the ideology and how do you understand ideology is some global framework that reshapes society, culture, and politics, or just as, I don't know, some kind of rhetoric that accompanies certain politics. I asked this largely because of the last part of our text about the reapproachment between Napoleon and Paul, because I think it's very controversial point in historiography generally. You actually mention it, and you say that there were reasons why Paul supported Napoleon, certain actions of Napoleon, like unifying the rules, fighting against the revolutionary radicals, etc. But anyway, I mean, by most of the contemporaries, Napoleon was perceived as a product of revolution. He's some kind of revolutionary dictator. And it looks like, if we just will reduce it to basics, that Paul supports this revolutionary dictator against the legitimate monarchs, even though these monarchs weren't so nice to him, his army, and all that. But they're Habsburgs, and this just is a Napoleon. And maybe it would have been, I don't know, fruitful to deep down in this specific moment to explain why it doesn't contradict the Paul's ideology, because in my opinion, to some degree, it might look that at some moment, Paul just, I don't know, placed pragmatic interests above this counter-revolutionary ideology, and that has to say something about the ideology. And the second question, more about the sources, I think. At the beginning of the text, you mentioned Andrei Zorin and his understanding of ideology, largely as something that was drawn from the literary and poetic tradition, and it was very connected to it. And I mean, you mentioned some of the sources of Paul's counter-revolutionary ideology, such as the Duke of Brunswick manifesto. But I was thinking about, can we just trace this certain rhetoric and this certain discourse that obviously have some templates, the phrases that they used in official documents and all these narratives? Can we trace its connection to some literary tradition? that existed before. Some of the scholarship, well, perhaps something like the conspiracy literacy tradition emerging from the 1720s, or maybe the literature of emigre aristocrats that had been reading a lot, because that was the century, the 18th century, and especially the second half of the 18th century, when they were created this anti-revolutionary narrative. And it was a lot been said about the the influence of the ideology on a further developments in the times of Alexander I and etc. And I agree with that point, but I think more could be said about the sources. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. These are extremely helpful. I'm definitely interested in the second question. I don't have anything to say about it because I haven't looked at that comparison, but I think you're right that there's something there and I should follow through on that. In terms of the relationship to Napoleon, I mean, to me, the analogous case is the relationship between the Smena Verkhovtsi and the Soviet state in the 1920s and 30s. And sort of the whole idea that sort of you could have that suddenly they realize that even though Stalin is the product of the revolution, he can nonetheless be the bearer of national goals. And I think that Napoleon occupies a very similar role in that he is both the product and the negation of the revolution. And I think this explains why a number of French conservatives immediately kind of jumped ship and became partisans of Napoleon for the reasons that I sort of outlined, that he's pro-clerical, that he's pro-monarchical, and yet, he seems to be winning in a way that all old monarchs were not. But I think you're right that I need to dig into this more deeply and spend some time on that moment, because it really is the moment when the ideology breaks down in a way. And maybe that moment of breakdown is the most interesting part of it. So I will definitely pay attention to both of those things. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I was muted. Catherine, you're next, and then Chris. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Greg, I really enjoyed reading this paper. And I have a sort of very small point, which is that I wonder, since you are pitching this to a broader audience, if it wouldn't be worth explaining a little bit about why Paul was assassinated. Europeanists may not be completely familiar with that, and it's just kind of interesting. And I think you just kind of mentioned it in passing. So I think that might pique some curiosity and be worth exploring. But it also could be worth doing because I think it ties into your overall argument. Because although I'm not entirely familiar with what the scholarly consensus is on that assassination, does it not have something to do with Paul's inconstancy, right? You add a kind of, your narrative that you're telling goes so against the kind of the inconstancy of Paul, the instability of that figure in history. And so I wonder kind of how that assassination is reread now through your ideological argument.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this actually, because I still don't have a good explanation for why Paul was assassinated. And the best explanation that I have is basically that, and this has to do with, in my class on ideology, we've been reading Karamzin's text on Old and New Russia, and his description of Paul is very compelling because in some ways, Paul is the manifestation of Karamzin's absolutist values, but on the other hand, he indicts Paul for being insufficiently attentive to his aristocracy that he relies on. And I think maybe part of the reason for Paul's assassination is precisely that he was not consistent enough in his aristocratic principles, and he didn't pay enough attention to the fact that you needed to court the aristocracy and keep their loyalty. Of course, one of the other explanations that has been bandied about over the years is that the British paid for Paul to be assassinated so that Russia would join the coalition against Napoleon. But obviously, that's not a very well-sourced argument, and it's a kind of a conspiracy theory. But I think both of those explanations would have something to do with the argument that I'm making. So thank you. I will add at least a paragraph on that. I think that that's really valuable.
Chris.
Hi, thanks, Greg. I really enjoyed this paper. I especially I like to right off the bat in the sort of framing as a sort of a humanitarian war, especially at this time when a sort of a discourse of human rights is really taking off. And given what that discourse, it seems to me like if you read someone like Samuel Moyn or something, that discourse of human rights serves a very similar purpose in the 20th century that this served at the end of the 18th century. That sort of, what is it, that famous phrase that, they'll greet us as liberators, not as conquerors, and at the beginning of the sort of Iraq War. My sort of question is, it's like your argument seems very two-pronged. It's a strong focus on Paul and on Suvorov. And I guess my question is, to what degree do they kind of serve as a kind of synecdoche for, like, to what degree is the position that they hold widely felt? Because it seems to me that, like, and I enjoy the weirdness of this. I mean, it does seem to me that there's sort of an idiosyncratic set of foreign policy maneuvers that you've actually kind of knit together as a fairly coherent kind of ideological program. And I'm wondering, to what degree is there, like, some of the latency that people have been mentioning, to what degree can you kind of bring that forward? Like, are there other voices? Is there, like, who's Paul's Nikita Panin or Alexander Vorontsov, I guess, these sort of figures who, these sort of foreign policy ministers, I guess, because, when I think of an ideology, it sort of, it does come across as something much more coherent and something that has a kind of a corpus behind it. That may not be the case. And that, which would make this very interesting, given the fact that part of your argument seems to be that this sort of kickstarts a much more kind of coherent conservative program in the 19th century. And, maybe this is just, you kind of mentioned in your preamble that you haven't had access to the sources. So maybe the sources will provide this, but I don't know, for now, can you speak to a sort of a larger ideological program? And I guess on top of that, I mean, they're launching a war. I mean, that requires a lot of people. Like, what do other people think about this sort of, sort of excursion into the middle of Europe, right? That would sort of maybe speak to something more broadly ideological, or is there sort of, there is no consensus and we've just sort of picked out these two figures because they're especially important in this and they have a kind of legacy that other voices don't have. I'm rambling, guess, a little bit, but hopefully, like, to what degree is there sort of, to what degree are these sort of ideological positions more widely felt within the sort of Russian court, I guess, would be the sort of distillation of my question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't, I think I need to do a lot more reading in the papers of, people like Rostopchin and others. I kind of get the sense that nobody quite believed in Paul's vision to the extent that Paul himself believed it, other than maybe Suvorov himself. And even though Suvorov had a lot of clashes with Paul, and maybe someone like Fuchs, who is like really a true believer. And I think that maybe that's another explanation for the assassination ultimately, is that Paul was unable to mobilize his elites in the service of this expansive vision. But I think I need to do more work to establish that. For me, like, I think that there's a sort of ambient counter-revolutionary sort of animus floating around in the capitals, but whether it's consistent to the degree that Paul wanted it to be, I don't think it is. And I think I need to have some of those voices. So yeah, that's really useful.
All right, Katya, and then Eric.
Is that me?
That's you, Catherine, yes.
Cool.
I'm jumping you up to the top of the queue because Eric already
I
spoke.
know, Eric already had a chance to speak. But actually, I'm going to echo his questions a little bit. So that's good too. So I had a ridiculously short time to read this essay, but I found it extremely engaging and interesting. And in answer to your question of whether it's obvious, it's completely not obvious. So I think, Greg, only to you, it seems that way. And I would echo Eric in the sense that it, I mean, to me, it put back a lot of these issues much earlier. I mean, this is 1799, and that image of Russia representing certain ideas in that way for most of us is associated with Alexander's period and Nicholas, as you point out. So it does not seem to me self-evident in the least. But the question I'd like to ask is more, and it's a question I have myself, I don't know the answer to. It's more technical in a way, and it has to do with nodal points or chronological turning points. Because the Russian armies in Europe is not as unusual as we think. Dominic Levin brought it to the fore when he put 1813 front and center. But as an 18th century special, you're coming from the earlier period. And so thinking back to that, okay, so in 1748, the Russian armies are standing on the Rhine. And according to Solovyov, this was the reason for the end of the War of the Austrian Succession, even though they never fired a shot. They're sitting in East Prussia and Königsberg for 4 years during the 7 Years' War, which was an incredible logistical feat. Not to mention later on the Battle of Cheshme, where the fleet is in the Mediterranean and bombs the Turkish fleet out of existence very quickly. So the bare fact of Russian armies being in Europe, and I don't know what qualifies as more west, more south, or whatever, but what I'm puzzled by is where is the moment where propaganda starts to play in? Because what I found fascinating in your narrative is they're there not simply as a military force, but they're trying to rouse the local population to their cause, right? So I guess the question is, how are they doing this? And is this the first time? Or I simply don't know. I mean, this Barbara Stolberg argues about Maria Theresia, that there was a propaganda element in the 7 Years' War. I don't know that there was one for Russia. So I guess the question, the nexus between propaganda and war is something that's interesting to me. And what would be the mechanisms by which they would be promoting this ideology? And again, I think you've moved the date significantly earlier than what we thought. So that seems to me really important.
Yeah, I think what's unique about this is not necessarily just the physical lack of proximity between northern Italy and Russia. I think it's also the kind of, you can understand Russia's intervention in the 7 Years' War within the framework of a kind of Russian national interest, right? There's a sort of, it makes sense that Russia would occupy East Prussia because it's adjacent to Courland and all these other places. But whereas why Russian troops would be in Italy and like spending their own lives and money on restoring the Piedmontese monarchy of all things, it seems harder to explain. And the accounts that I've seen from historians of that period are basically that like the material gain that Paul hoped to extract from this was the defense of Malta. But those troops in northern Italy were not being sent to defend Malta. And in fact, the whole reason for the defense of Malta was itself ideological. So I think that that's the kind of weirdness. It's not so much the distance, although I think the distance is interesting, but it's the sort of disconnection from the pragmatic politics of state making and warfare that we'd sort of been used to in the 18th century with these sort of cabinet wars. In terms of propaganda, yeah, I mean, I think this genre of manifestos and sort of public proclamations that Suvorov makes at every turn, I think it's very significant. And he's attentive to the public reception of his troops and his mission in a way that I have not previously encountered in the annals of Russian warfare. I mean, he's very concerned with winning hearts and minds, which I think is what makes this a different kind of campaign than most previous Russian wars. But I'm not as well read about the 7 Years' War as I should be. So Barbara Stolberg, you said, is that Stolberg?
Stolberg Rillinger, yes. It's on Maria. It's not that, it's just a chapter in which she includes stuff on propaganda. It's not that good actually on the 7 Years' War. It's a great book, but not that particular aspect. But I noticed that she brings in propaganda, and it's a puzzle to me because I just don't know when the propaganda was introduced as a military tool. So I'm just thinking really specific chronology. Say what in 1763 is one thing, 1799 is another thing, but what are those points where that kind of technique starts to be used. I'm sure you probably know more than I do on that, or could if you thought about it. So I would be really interested to have that conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really useful. Thanks a lot.
Well, I think Bell's, David Bell's book on the Napoleonic Wars might be of use when he talks about the history of modern total war. But propaganda, of course, means the dissemination of ideas. So ideology, not just as a system of ideas, but as a disseminated system of ideas. That's what often comes into like the modernness, the modernity of modern ideology. So I think it is a really important issue. Eric, last but not least, we have a few minutes left. So if there's anyone else who hasn't spoken, raise your hand or forever hold your peace. But Eric, you're bringing up the rear.
Yeah, sure. So the more this conversation has gone on, the more I'm starting to think that the thing I learned the most from this paper is on the theme of ecumenism and the idea that something new happened in the Napoleonic era in Russian foreign policy, and something that didn't last, actually. I mean, the idea that in the era of the annexations of the partitions of Poland and the struggle between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, which, I mean, granted, it probably became more ideological later, but that in that era, the leaders of the Russian foreign policy establishment would go out and make alliances with Catholics across Europe is kind of a startling kind of thing. And I'm kind of shocked and embarrassed that I didn't know some of the facts you threw into this paper. In fact, it was the things I learned the most from this paper were about Paul's support for Catholics during the Napoleonic era. And so that, I think that's really promising, because I think it really makes a good case for your argument that it was ideological rather than state interest driven or Russocentric, as Misha mentioned. They were going against a lot of deep traditions to like make an alliance with Catholics, and it's something that wasn't sustainable. I mean, it certainly by the 1830s was back to Orthodoxy first and foremost, and that continued through most of the rest of the century. So that, I think, has a lot of promise as something to work on and develop. I mean, even in one of the biggest foreign policy decisions of the 19th century, the Crimean War, I mean, David Goldfrank isn't here, but his shadow is, and he argued that the whole dispute over the holy places was huge, and it's just striking to me how these deep traditions of anti-Catholicism were kind of overcome in an ideological way in this period, and in the broader sense, of course, I mean, if you're talking about ideology and foreign policy, ecumenism is also a big departure. I mean, it was the foreign policy was all about the Protestant versus Catholic wars and struggles over 2 centuries, at least 2.5 centuries. So I think there's a lot of prospect there. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm gonna. I think one of the interesting things about this is that both Paul and Alexander were accused at various moments of wanting to establish a union between the Protestant and Catholic churches, or the Orthodox and Catholic churches, rather. And in fact, Marie-Pierre Ray argues pretty persuasively in her biography of Alexander that he, in fact, did send someone to the Pope with a request to unify the churches. That may be another conspiracy theory because it sounds so wildly unlikely in retrospect, but in the context of the time, it makes sense, right? That what you're defending is religion qua religion and not as a particular tradition. And I think I do think that this is an underappreciated aspect. I also wanted to address Elise's point in the chat. I think, yeah, Catherine's reign did produce civic propaganda, and especially I want to see this in the context of what Catherine's relationship to, say, the rights of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. And I wonder if there is a connection between this kind of propaganda in terms of the Russians as defending, and as well as Catherine's commitment to defending, non-Catholics in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Like, I wonder if there's some relationship there between those kinds of ideological arguments and the later counter-revolutionary propaganda. But I think that the Catherinian precedent is significant. Yeah.
Christine, last but not least.
Thank you. It's been a really interesting discussion. I wasn't going to mention this, but since Eric mentioned the Catholic connection, we do have a strong Jesuit presence, and Russia's the area that certainly welcomes them into existence, or they can stay viable within Russia when they're disbanded by the Pope. So there's been a lot of recent work on Catholic influences, and that's going to change, obviously, but this seems to be a pivotal moment. And the one thing that I was thinking the whole time I was reading it, I think what you're trying to do is something that Elise Wirtschafter has done in her book for Alexander, and that is the first, and to basically try to strip away the mythology that has developed around the foreign policies of this. And I could be wrong here, but I'm seeing a lot of continuity with what she writes about Alexander. But her whole point is that Alexander's foreign policy was not dictated by this so-called mysticism, but was really a part of a conversation with European thinking at the time. And so she's trying to, rebalance the conversation and to take it away from the weirdness of supposedly Alexander and the myths that, developed around him, particularly within the Russian context, with his not having died, but became a strannik, who wandered the landscape and so on. And so I think in this paper, I would certainly beef up that historiographical section. I mean, if as you get into the primary literature that you haven't been able to access, if your hypotheses here, based on what you have read, are playing out, then you've got a much stronger way of sort of expressing, that something is, really gelling here. And it may not be so much about eccentricities of characters, but rather individuals on the stage of history, seeing history unfold, they react in certain ways. And that's difficult for us to, yes, sort of I think as historians, we try to put too much emphasis on our own knowledge of how history progresses. And I would strip that away, take away your notions of Stalin and whatever. I think you really have to go back into the 18th century mindset here. And I think that's what you're trying to do. And I would encourage you to continue doing so, but obviously filling it in with more primary materials will be critical in all of this. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I do think that, I think one of the things that I have ended up liking about this paper is the way that Paul and Suvorov sort of play off of each other, because, even though Paul and Suvorov have such fundamental disagreements, they nonetheless express a shared worldview. And I think that sort of bolsters, I think, an argument about Paul as being less motivated by his own eccentricities and more motivated by a general agenda that is actually shared relatively widely. And so and I do hope to definitely fill in more of the primary and secondary materials. And thanks for reminding me of the necessity of that. I think it's hard for me to see where it could fit in, but I could definitely, as Misha said, I think it could definitely stand to add 10 more pages or so to this piece to beef it up.
So thank you. It's been a really interesting discussion. So thank you to everyone. And